Basically, what Donald Trump has done is to try to monetize himself. The problem is when the president does this, what he is doing is he's monetizing the powers of the presidency. And he is allowing any individual or entity anywhere in the world to anonymously and securely purchase a stake in his personal net worth in a way that is totally opaque to any regulatory body. Chinese Communist Party official, a Saudi prince, a Venezuelan despot can go to the president and say, listen, nobody knows this, but I have the crypto key and it shows that I own 7% of your net worth. By the way, not at all a ridiculous example because his net worth is probably more than 50% tied up in this coin now. And he'll know and they'll know, but nobody else in the world will know. That's an obvious problem for American security. And I guarantee you the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, the Turks have all bought this coin.
Welcome back to Just the Facts, and today's guest is Congressman Jake Auchincloss, who is an amazing person. He has been in Congress for 3 terms now. He's in his 3rd term. But before that, he was on the city council. Before that, he was serving in the Marines in Afghanistan and Panama. And before that, he was at Harvard. And during his time in the Congress or in the city council, he also got his master's at MIT. So he has a lot to talk about. And I want to start, though, Jake, if you don't mind, with talking about an article you just wrote for The Economist. And if you could skip all the technical theories of economy and talk about how this could lead to Democrats taking back the narrative on the economy and showing people that we know what we're doing.
Jill, thanks for having me on. I wrote a piece for The Economist that argues that the Democratic agenda on the economy should be financial freedom for the middle class. In particular, the middle class spends about half of its income on just housing and healthcare by itself. Just housing and healthcare. Both of those sectors have inflated faster than the overall economy over the last 60 years, such that health insurance premiums now are going up about twice as fast as wages, and housing, whether rent or mortgage payments, are suffocating the middle class and preventing first-time home buyers from getting that first rung on the ladder of home ownership and generational wealth. And the Democrats need to be laser focused on making housing and healthcare more affordable. For example, on housing, we need to do a few things simultaneously. We need to enact really muscular zoning and land use reforms so that people can build more of the missing middle housing, the 2 to 10 unit apartment blocks that are the workhorse of affordability. And we need to flip the script on federal financing of housing so that we are inducing more production of housing rather than just subsidizing demand for housing. But we have to have a supply-oriented vision of building 5 million units of housing over the next 5 years to actually lower the biggest single budget item in the middle class family, which is the cost of housing.
I was interested in your perspective in this piece about manufacturing housing. Right now, it is done by intensive labor. And so it becomes very expensive to do that, and as opposed to it being a mass-produced product. So what do you envision? Do you envision going back to, I don't even know exactly when this was, even before my time, the Sears prefab homes? Is that what you're talking about? I'm just not sure.
Let me start, before we get into the numbers, let me just start with a thought exercise for our listeners here. Imagine in your head that you built your car the way you built your house. So you stood in your driveway, you called the general contractor came up, he said, here's the kind of car that I want. And then the general contractor hired a bunch of subcontractors and a bunch of mechanics came to your driveway and they ordered each part and they assembled the car in your driveway. And I would ask our listeners, how much do you think your car would cost? And do you think your car would run as well as it does now? I think most people would say, wow, my car would cost a lot more than it does, and it probably wouldn't run as well. But it's actually not a fantastical idea because that's how we build houses. And actually, in terms of economic complexity, cars and houses are actually kind of on a par. They're not too dissimilar from one another. What happened to cars is that cars went from something that is constructed to something that is manufactured. And the reason that matters is that since the year 1960, productivity in the manufacturing sector has gone up about 800%. Productivity in the construction sector has gone down since 1960. So anytime you are constructing something versus manufacturing it, you are going to be paying a lot more money for any given unit of value. Does that mean that we are all of a sudden going to manufacture every home in America? No, of course it does not. There's lots of homes that need to be stick built for a lot of different reasons. But what it does mean is that factory built housing, and the technology is getting very good for this, for those 2 to 10 apartment blocks really can be an engine of not just affordability, but also really good jobs throughout the country.
Okay. And will that be part of what you think Democrats should be messaging so that we can convince people that Democrats actually do know how to improve the economy for people, and also address in general the messaging issue, because that seems to be a big problem for Democrats, is that their values are right, but they're not communicating in simple terms in the way that the Republicans are.
I don't think we should be messaging. I think we should be doing it. There's a lot of focus on the trifecta in Washington. The GOP has the House, the Senate, the presidency, right? Well, what about the trifecta that Democrats have in California, in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, in Illinois,
Illinois.
right? So, listen, I think the governor of Massachusetts is doing a great job on a lot of different fronts. One thing that we could be doing here in Massachusetts is let's take a decommissioned military base, Fort Devens or Weymouth Naval Air Station, which are now state property, not subject to local zoning, and build 100,000 units of housing. Some of that can be manufactured housing, some of that can be stick-built housing, depending on the topography. But actually, just do it, right? Same thing with education, by the way, right? I mean, Democrats have been on our back heels for the last 5 years, responding to bathrooms and locker rooms because we don't have a plan for classrooms. We know that post-pandemic, about half of American students are behind grade level for reading and mathematics. The average ninth grader has a sixth grade education. It's embarrassing. And candidly, Democrats own some of that because of the school closures that happen in blue cities and blue states. But we can also fix it. Let's go surge one-on-one high dosage tutoring to every student in America. Let's build 1,000 trade schools. We can operate at the state and local level in ways that don't message what Democrats are for, but just go show the middle class, hey, if you're worried about housing, if you're worried about education, we actually have a plan.
So you just mentioned something that's very dear to my heart, so I'm going to divert for a second. I was the chief officer for career and technical education for the Chicago Public Schools, and I see a great value in diverting some of our education dollars to the technical education sector, which has, it is vocational training, but it is also education. And I'm just wondering how you feel about trying to bring back that kind of training so that we will have workers ready to do the kinds of jobs that would be required here.
Jill, I'm passionate about it. We need to build 5 million units of housing, more ships in the Chinese Navy, 5 Hoover dams worth of nuclear power over the next decade.
Wow.
And we're, as valuable as I think a liberal arts degree, and I've got one, can be, it is not the only way to for people to have economic mobility and for people to contribute. And we got to have a lot more people who know how to build stuff. The trade schools are a fantastic way to do that. We should be building 1,000 trade schools across this country. We should be funding them with a digital advertising tax on the social media corporations. We should be partnering with organized labor and with employers to ensure that the skills and the apprenticeships are matching up with employment. And we should get a bunch of Americans, particularly young men, by the way, who are really struggling right now. We should get them united in a common mission because everybody has something to contribute. You had mentioned at the top of this interview, Jill, I've got degrees from Harvard and MIT. I'm one of those overeducated elites that Donald Trump hates so much, right? You know what? I tried to change the lock on my garage door a couple months ago, and I did such a bad job of it. I literally had to call not just a locksmith, but a carpenter also to fix both the lock and the door itself. And that was a battery-operated lock. I mean,
oh my God.
So I don't know how to do a lot of stuff, all the fancy degrees I have. We need people who know to build stuff in this country, and trade schools are a really important way to do it.
It really does work. And many of them, one of my proudest accomplishments was starting DeVry Advantage Academy, which was a partnership with DeVry University where the students graduate high school in 4 years with an associate degree as well as a diploma. And they are prepared for a network systems administration job, which is a really high-paying, valued job. But most of them went on to 4 years of college because they learned they could go to college. So I'm with you on that subject. But okay, let's stick with the Democratic messaging. And you mentioned, we're talking a lot about LGBTQ, which I'm passionate about. I'm very supportive of, but it's not what people care about. People seem to care about the economy. They care about and the economy as it affects them. What does it mean to them in terms of groceries and rent? They care about healthcare and the price of healthcare. They care about things that really matter to them, not the things that Democrats are messaging about cruelty and corruption and democracy. That's not resonating. So how do we reform not just what we do, which is, of course, the best messaging is to show, but there is still people who are only going to listen, and some of the doing is going to take more years than we have before the midterms. What can we say that will let people hear and vote Democratic?
You had mentioned corruption. I actually do think that's critical to this because the Trump administration is fundamentally about the grift. Both he himself with his Trump family meme coin and his constant violations of the emoluments clause and his corruption, but also the broader patrimony he has put around him are all a bunch of people who are in on the grift. Most Americans, in fact, a supermajority of Americans, believe that Washington is deeply corrupt. Tying the corruption of Donald Trump to the chaos and higher costs of Americans' lives, I think, is deeply impactful. Talking about them in isolation, I think, is less impactful, but tying them together matters. Let me give you an example of that. RFK Jr., the Secretary of Health and Human Services, came to my committee of jurisdiction a couple weeks ago, and he tried to get away with his typical approach of sort of high level hand waving around chronic disease, which, at the highest level is neither controversial nor unreasonable. I think, Americans' increasing intakes of glucose and fructose have definitely led to higher chronic disease. It's something we have to tackle. Michelle Obama has been talking about this. Rock on. Happy to talk about bipartisan policies we could pursue. But here's the core challenge is that fundamentally he's doing nothing on those issues. What he is doing is hooking up his cronies out of conflict of interest and corruption. So someone like Brad Smith, who was the head of healthcare for Doge, runs a company on the side called Main Street Health. Its biggest investors are all the big health insurance corporations that service Medicare Advantage. So United Health Group and Cigna, et cetera, right? So they are regulated and reimbursed by Medicare. They invest in Brad Smith's company. Well, that's very convenient because Brad Smith was running CMS for 100 days. And guess what? He took a Biden rule that was going to increase oversight and lower reimbursement for those health insurance corporations. And wouldn't you know it, he flipped it. And now instead, less regulation, more reimbursement for his investors. That angers Americans. And we've got to start telling that story like I tried to do when RFK came to our committee.
That's so important. It really is. I know that the people listening to us right now are probably on our side, but it's getting that message out to the people who are listening to Fox News and not here. That's distressing. But we just were talking about the midterms and how important that is. And I have to ask you, because there's a rumor that you might be getting into a primary battle for the Senate seat. Is there any truth to the rumor? You want to comment on that?
As you say, rumors abound. I'm last cycle, my leadership PAC, Beyond Thoughts and Prayers, which is dedicated to gun safety legislation, I supported every single frontline Democrat and every single red to blue Democrat, basically all the battleground Democrats out there who can help flip the House. And I'm going to do the same thing this cycle. I am in it to make Hakeem Jeffries the Speaker of the House because ultimately, the best way that we can turn Donald Trump into a lame duck, as important as the appropriations fights are, as appropriate as litigation is, as vital as public campaigns are, the best way is for the House of Representatives to be Democratic controlled. And that's my absolute top focus.
Okay, so I'm still going to push a little bit because as I've been reading a lot about a possible primary battle against Senator Markey, or if Senator Markey, who will be, I think, 80 when he's up for re-election in 26, decides not to run. I assume you're not going to rule out the possibility that you would take on that challenge, although it would mean giving up your House seat if you ran for that.
I don't slam doors shut in politics. But what I'm saying is what the country absolutely needs right now is a Democratic Speaker of the House of
Yes.
Representatives. That's my focus right now. I think there are important debates to be had within the party about uh, generational change, about ideological change, and we've discussed some of the issues that animate that, whether it's cost disease, whether it's social media corporations, whether it's the schools and the trades. We need to be having these debates as a party. I don't shy away from these debates. There's this
Yeah.
view that somehow the Democrats need to rally behind a standard bearer and choose a message and get in lockstep. I actually disagree with that. I think we can be wholly capable of fighting against Donald Trump, maintaining midterm discipline, while still having the kind of generational debate we need as a party. Because this is the first time in 30 years, really since the early 90s, that the party's leadership and ideological canvas has been blank, and that's not a bad thing. We need that. We just got our clock cleaned by a felon. We have some introspection to.
Well, let's talk about a couple things that you just mentioned. Um, and one is Hakeem being the speaker, which would be, of course, amazing. But in the interim, between now and the possibility of that happening, and I do think it's a good possibility and certainly important, what are the powers that the minority has in the House? Is there anything that hasn't been tried? I mean, obviously, his speech delayed a vote on a horrible bill. And I hope we have time to get to your comments on what you think the worst aspects of what he calls the big, beautiful bill. I would call the big, beautiful transfer of wealth bill, big, ugly bill. Um, what powers might there be hidden away that Democrats could use right now?
The core power that we have. Well, actually, let me back up a step. The House is a majoritarian institution, so it's always frustrating being in the minority. What is unique about this term, though, is that not only are Democrats in the minority, obviously, but we are in the minority to a majority party that actually has no
Yes.
inclination to govern for itself.
Yeah.
The founders envisioned that the presidency might become overzealous in its grabs for power. What I think the founders did not fully appreciate is that partisanship would overwhelm the checks and balances of our tripartite system, wherein Congress would actually just become courtiers to Donald Trump. So Speaker Johnson and John Thune and all these representatives and senators who put on their frowny faces and pretend like they have got big concerns about this bill before they inevitably fold, they are not actually lawmakers in any real sense of the word. I mean, the House, the Office of Management and Budget under Russ Vogt, that's basically Congress as far as Speaker Johnson is concerned. He tells him what he's going to do, and Johnson just goes in lockstep. That is really unique and makes it especially frustrating because, for example, when I'm trying to do oversight of RFK, an oversight should be a nonpartisan or at least a cross-partisan function. I can't get the health subcommittee chair to join me on basic questions because, as far as he's concerned, the dear leader didn't bless it. So what Democrats have to do in the minority is we got to collect the receipts, we got to prepare the investigations, we've got to fight back on the appropriations process where we do have leverage because of the filibuster. But perhaps most imperatively, what we have to do is connect the dots for the American public from what's happening inside the chamber to what's happening in their lives. We are the conduit. We have to explain why it matters that HHS is so corrupt. We have to explain why it matters that the IRS has been shackled from doing basic audits of the very wealthy. We have to explain why it matters that the ATF now is going to make ghost guns easier for people to get, right? Like that is our job so that we can build a public pressure campaign that turns into a midterm victory.
And what do you think the three things in the bill that we should be talking most about are? I mean, there's dozens, obviously, that need attention, and maybe it's three this week and three next week. But Donald
Yep.
Trump seems to focus on one thing repetitively, and it gets through. What are the top things we should talk about from this bill?
Healthcare costs are going to go up. Not just if you have Medicaid. This is not just about people who have Medicaid. Yes, 10 million people could lose Medicaid insurance. That's a catastrophe, for them. But we should be crystal clear. We are not saving money in the overall US healthcare system. What we are doing is privatizing the cost of healthcare for the middle class. So we are telling the middle class, hey, if you get insurance through the ACA exchanges, if you get insurance through your employer, you will pay more in your premiums. And the reason why you're going to pay more in your premiums is that all those people who just got kicked off of Medicaid, even though they were working because they didn't fill out some paperwork requirement, they still get sick and they still go to the emergency room. But now that's going to be uncompensated care. And the hospital is going to cross subsidize that with higher rates to the commercial providers, and your premiums will go up to pay for it. So now instead of the rich paying a little bit more in taxes so that everybody has access to health care, the middle class will pay more in health insurance premiums because Donald Trump wanted to hook up his closest donors. That's number one. Healthcare costs are going up for everybody. Number two, I think, needs to be the national debt. They're adding somewhere between $4 to $6 trillion, depending on your assumptions. I don't ever again want to hear any Republican talk about fiscal responsibility. Gone, done. They've lost it. This is an opportunity for Democrats to say, you know what? The last president to balance the budget was a Democrat, Bill Clinton. The next president's going to be a Democrat too. We can now own this issue, but it requires us to actually put forward a compelling plan to Americans. Probably 2/3 tax increases on the wealthiest, 1/3 spending reductions to get us to a place where the national debt is on a downward trajectory, because 8% GDP deficits is deeply unsustainable for our children. It's unfair to them.
Thank you for that. And let's talk a little bit more about, you mentioned crypto at one point, and I'm going to look over here to read what I thought was sort of interesting quote that I read. Leading Democrats such as Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Jake Auchincloss have officially asked authorities to look into the Trump family's introduction of the, I don't even know how to say it, is $Trump and $Melania tokens. They contend that by circumventing conventional emoluments regulation and utilizing insider advantages, these coins might act as profit centers for political figures or even foreign influence operations. Can you talk a little more about that and what can be done? Is there a way to make the emoluments clause have any teeth, to have it have some consequences if you violate it, which Donald Trump has repeatedly done?
I'm well aware of how high the bar is, but I would argue that this is the most corrupt thing Donald Trump has ever done. And Senator Warren and I wrote this letter and inquiry back in January, and unfortunately, what we have predicted is already happening. So, for our listeners who may not be familiar with meme coins, basically what Donald Trump has done is to try to monetize himself. And celebrities have done this, and other public figures have done this, where you basically issue tokens that are part of you and your brand. And if celebrities want to do this, I think it's a little silly. I personally wouldn't buy one. Not sure it's illegal, but it as long as it's subject to securities law, I guess whatever. The problem is when the president does this, what he is doing is he's monetizing the powers of the presidency.
Yeah.
And he is allowing any individual or entity anywhere in the world to anonymously and securely purchase a stake in his personal net worth in a way that is totally opaque to any regulatory body. But, and I think this is critical, is cryptographically guaranteed ownership that they can present to the president. So, Chinese Communist Party official, a Saudi prince, a Venezuelan despot can go to the president and say, listen, nobody knows this, but I have the crypto key, and it shows that I own 7% of your net worth. By the way, not at all a ridiculous example, because his net worth is probably more than 50% tied up in this coin now. And he'll know and they'll know, but nobody else in the world will know. That's an obvious problem for American security. And I guarantee you the Russian, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Venezuelans, the Turks have all bought this coin.
Yeah, it's another example of him taking the plane from Qatar. It just is so obvious. I don't know how people aren't more concerned about it. But I'm worried we're going to run out of time, and there's at least two hot current things, which is today there's a meeting in the White House of Netanyahu and Trump. Do you have any insight for us on what you think might happen? Who's going to get anything out of it? Do you think there's going to be some sort of peace negotiation? What do you predict?
I am hopeful for progress towards hostage release, which really is the final roadblock to some type of post-war governance in Gaza. Hamas needs to release all 20 of these hostages, as well as the remains of those who are deceased. And Hamas needs to renounce its claims to governance in Gaza. Those are two non-negotiables. No sane country, Israel or otherwise, would ever allow a death cult to operate on
Yeah.
its near southern border. And Hamas needs to understand it's not going to govern Gaza, and it's not going to be keeping these hostages in perpetuity. Those two need to be resolved. And because Israel is now in a stronger position in the Middle East than it has been in decades, arguably ever, I think the ability to resolve them is closer than it has ever been.
Boy, I hope you're right. What I've been hearing this morning, of course, is Hamas is saying, no way we will ever agree to the dissolution of Hamas. And that is obviously something that Israel is going to say is an absolute essential. So I hope
Well,
you're
I
right.
think there's a little bit of I think there's a lot of semantic play in the joints there. The dissolution of Hamas is different than Hamas governance over Gaza, right? I mean, whether or not
Yeah.
Hamas exists as an ideological conception versus whether Hamas has a monopoly on the use of organized violence in Gaza is a different thing.
Excellent. And so, one last um, tragedy that has occurred, of course, was the flooding in Texas and the ongoing, I hope it's rescue, but maybe recovery mission at this point. And you are on a committee that has some insight into our environment. And I'm just wondering, how much do you think is the missing parts of what's happening now with the diminution of FEMA, of NOAA, of the National Weather Service? I understand that there was some warning given, although perhaps late, but then you hear all this uh, discussion of without the Weather Service, we're going to have more of these unnotified events. Is your committee looking at this? What can you tell us about that?
I don't want to weigh in on this particular tragedy because I don't have all the facts yet, and I think it's important for me to get the facts before I make assertions about
Yeah.
whether public services or warnings could have prevented it. I think there is, though, a broad point that we can make, which is that the government does a lot of things like this: the early warning for flash flooding, air traffic control, uh, subsidies or support for distribution of vaccines. It does a lot of things that are nuts and bolts and kind of boring and don't get a lot of public purview, and that add up to a sum total of something like 15% of the overall federal budget and going down as a total share. It's just really not that expensive. And what Elon Musk and Donald Trump did is they said to the American people, we're going to save $1 trillion by cutting USAID, and 200,000 kids may get polio globally, but we're going to save tons of money. And it's an intellectually dishonest exercise because you could pick up the Pentagon and shake it, and out of its couch cushions would fall all the money that is used to pay for the USAID. I mean, quite literally, the Pentagon has misplaced more funding through its own audits than the USAID spends annually. So it's a dishonest explanation to the American people about where their taxpayer dollars go. Where their taxpayer dollars go is on servicing the national debt, on Medicare, on Medicaid, and Social Security. We can have debates about those programs and how people want to fund them and how they want to spend that money, but that's where the money goes. Things like NOAA and air traffic control and vaccines are not a meaningful portion of the federal budget, and cutting back on them does not save the American taxpayer money, but it does degrade public services.
So I have to ask you one more question because you are fascinating. And every time you say something, it makes me think of something else I want to ask you. You just mentioned Elon Musk and his latest feud with Donald Trump. We could talk about that and the latest feud about whether or not the Epstein files ever existed or have been lost or never existed. But what about his funding the start of a third party? What do you think about how that might impact 26 and 28?
You know, when Elon Musk joined the Trump administration, I gave him 6 months before he got uh, railroaded out of Washington D.C. And it's hard to take his political instincts or his ability to focus politically on a given task all that seriously. Now he's got a gajillion dollars, and so he's going to throw it at the problem potentially. But to me, that's more a testament to how badly we need reform of our campaign finance system. Billionaires shouldn't be able to buy the political conditions that they find most solicitous to their interests.
I used to say Citizens United was the worst decision the Supreme Court had ever made. But I would say this term, they have outdone themselves. And last term, I mean, between immunity and no national injunctions, they've maybe surpassed Citizens United. But yeah, there's a lot that we can talk about. And I hope you'll be willing to come back and talk about some of these really fascinating issues and what Congress can and must do to make us safer in America. But I am so grateful for you and for your service to America and for being with us today. Thank you, Jake Auchincloss. We really appreciate you.
Have a great week, Jill.
Thank you.